Ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the day, let's have a look again at the perspectives of the different sectors. What does it mean and how can we create data spaces in economic, incentive, governance and tech? It's a pleasure for me to hand over now for the following talk to, once again from Dortmund, Mr. Professor Boris Otto from the Fraunhofer Institute. And from Stuttgart, Mr. Nick Sharman, Project Director, Economic of Things at Robert Bosch. And also from Stuttgart is joining Mr. Christian Heise, Deputy Project Director, Economy of Things at Robert Bosch. Welcome, gentlemen. The stage is all yours.
Thank you again, Carmen, for the introduction. Yes, and you already said that, right? I mean, we heard 6 excellent presentations about why data spaces are needed for business innovation and why they are one of the fundamental requirements for sharing data. And also we heard in the morning that, let's say, sharing of data is something which we all together need to understand better in terms of bringing that down to the road, right? And if we then also take the look into the European data strategy, we see a very clear articulated call for 9 data spaces in certain domains. And of course, I think all of us have the question, well, saying that, what is actually a data space? And if I know that, how do I get one, right? And that is what our final session is all about. I'd like to ask you, Christian, to move to the next slide, please. What I want to do right now in the next couple of minutes is walk you a little bit through, well, the line of argumentation, what actually the role of data spaces is in ecosystems. Then I'd like also to spend a couple of minutes on the business rationale. I mean, it's not a hygiene factor that we are talking about, or a thing that we may do at a certain point of time, but it's an economic necessity. And I'd like to outline that once more, because it's always good to understand the drivers that are behind a certain initiative. And then, as mentioned earlier, I would like to spend a couple of minutes talking about how to create a data space. Next slide, please, Christian. Yes, we have seen, as mentioned earlier on, 6 actually very cool examples of ecosystems. And that is something that I'd like to stress. I mean, many of them put the end consumer, the end customer, the traveler, for example, in the center. And it became very, very clear that, let's say, many organizations need to organize around that in order to really achieve something innovative, some data-driven innovative service to the end customer. So in that sense, it's important to stress that an ecosystem is not, let's say, a new word for something old, like a value network or something, but it's really something conceptually new. An ecosystem is a multilateral form of organizing for joint customer innovation. That's important to understand. And also in ecosystems, we need to find an equilibrium, a balance between the viability of the ecosystem as a whole on the one hand side, but also on the business models of the individual members of the ecosystem on the other hand. And that basically drives the activities that we have up front of us. So Christian, to the next slide, please. How does that relate to data spaces then? Well, usually if we look into these kind of scenarios, it's useful to distinguish certain architectural layers. And on the upper part of this view graph, you see a typical ecosystem. This one is taken from the mobility domain. And I like very much what Jean-François Cazès said earlier on, that basically in the end, many of the things are directed to make the life of the traveler better, right? So these guys want to consume data-driven services to have a better life or to be more efficient or faster, right? And in order to do that, as heard, a number of data providers and users need to team up, and they have to build, well, what we called here a shared digital twin of their domain. And that is something that we can refer to as the data space mobility in this regard. So we need to have a consistent understanding on a semantic point of level of the objects that describe the real world objects that we commonly use or refer to, right? So that is something that we have to build together. And this is basically where the data spaces come to life. And underneath, on the lower part of the view graph, we see the software infrastructure, the federated software infrastructure that we will set a standard for with Gaia-X. So, and it's important to distinguish a little bit these layers, because we want to set, as I said, a technical standard, a software standard on the red layer. We need to work together to create consistent understandings and a shared digital twin on the blue layer. Sometimes this is referred to as a digital thread. And then we want to basically facilitate and enable cool business models and business innovation on the ecosystem layer. And in that regard, we shouldn't interfere so much and intervene so much with the individual business models, because the companies that come up with digital innovation probably know that better than us. So one slide ahead, please, Christian. So as mentioned earlier, I'd like to summarize when getting to this point of, let's say, understanding how data spaces are related to ecosystems and the underlying software infrastructure. It's again important to understand the drivers that force individual companies to think about, let's say, how should I embark into such a data space endeavor? And usually, as usual, we have some sort of a business ecosystem pull, which is displayed in the upper part of the view graph. Well, data is the key resource for customer innovation, as we have heard multiple times today. And also, no single organization has all the data in place that is needed to be successful in this innovative endeavor. And therefore, we need to team up in these co-opetition scenarios and also bring quid pro quo data sharing and trust initiatives down to the road. And that was very nicely also framed in the different presentations that we heard earlier on. But on the other hand, there's of course a technology push, right? It's not only a business need to embark into ecosystems and to create data spaces, but it's also driven by technology. Well, cloud platforms are, let's say, the natural fit for shared infrastructural information systems, because we need to have something in the middle of this ecosystem where data sharing can take place, right? And this will probably not behind the firewall in a traditional on-premise application, but this needs to be something in the middle, let's call it like that, of this ecosystem and cloud platforms. Also, the combination of cloud and edge cloud services reflects nicely how the world looks like, right? What we see is that artificial intelligence, computing power, and data processing capacity is spread all over the place. I mean, with the Internet of Things and the Internet of Everything, basically data processing is not done centrally, but it's basically, well, being done at the edge, at the device. And so we need to create some infrastructure that takes care of that and basically reflects it. And then, of course, as we all know, who we are in the cloud sector, there is enormous technological potential in using cloud technology. In particular, if we look into scaling opportunities, we heard that also earlier on, we need to be able to process and analyze large amounts of data, and also the automation potential. I mean, things like DevOps, for example, allow us to be much faster in basically realizing data-driven services and bringing them down to the road where they can be effective. So this is basically the scenery in which we operate when we talk about, let's say, what are the drivers that bring us to data spaces. Next slide, please, Christian. So talking about data spaces, what actually is that, right? I mean, and I would like to bring to your attention that this concept, that it's rather a data integration concept that has for the first time been introduced to the community some 15 years ago. And I'd like to stress that without, well, sounding too theoretical or academic. So general design principles are four. There is, let's say, envisage no physical data integration. So we want to leave data where it is and basically end up with a federated data architecture, pretty much in line with Gaia-X. So we want basically also not force everyone into a common schema, but we just want to envisage integration on a semantic level. That's why we use, let's say, RDF-based vocabularies, for example, which are basically proliferating quite well. Also, we allow for redundancy. Of course, different actors in an ecosystem basically share data on the same real world object. And they store the data for themselves. So nobody wants to be forced to dump everything into one bucket, but rather leave data where it is. And also data spaces and also endpoints in data spaces could be nested. And that is also important in the sense that we will probably not look into a data space creation project like a one-off project, because hopefully we will never be finished, right? Because this space is continuously growing, right, through the ramp up and onboarding of always new participants. So that is the let's say the pure theory, if you want to call it like that. And then from the IDS Association, which I mentioned earlier on, we added a couple of other design principles, which are along the lines of data sovereignty and the traceability of data transactions, and also on the fact that participants need to trust each other. So that's basically what a data space is. And as you can see, obviously, it fits nicely to the business needs, but also, let's say, about what we have in mind with Gaia-X. So next slide, Christian, please. So knowing that, then the question is, of course, at the table, okay, now I have understood what a data space in general is. Sounds good. So what does that mean, right? So what's next? So if I was to start a data space creation project tomorrow, what would I have to do? And that is the question that we all have in front of us, right? And that is important to understand, because there is a bunch of activities needed, not only on a technical level. And that is important, and that's the message that I'd like to convey. It was also mentioned earlier, in particular by Achim Wambach and Jacques Remer, I believe, who spoke about, well, two-sided or even multi-sided markets. And that means we need to create incentives for data providers to basically share their data in data spaces, and on the other hand, make the data space so interesting that we attract as many users as we can. And that are the typical challenges that we have to overcome when we talk about multi-sided or even also two-sided markets. Then the question arises also, well, okay, if we want to do that, of course, we want to attract traffic on the data space. Who's to pay for it, right? I mean, who's the one that funds the activities? And what we see is then also derived from a notion of infrastructures that we could ask ourselves, well, how do we finance infrastructures right now, and how did we do that in the past? And I don't want to anticipate too much, because that will be later on then touched upon by Nick and Christian. The next question that we usually step over is, well, okay, there is, we have this infrastructure thing, this data space. Well, and now how I want to fund it? Who runs it, right? So who is basically the owner, so to say, of the data space, and then the operator? And what we see heavily discussed these days is, well, public-private partnership organizations, but also the idea of cooperative organizations, like that we know from, let's say, the farming industry, or from, let's say, regional retail banking. So everybody owns a little bit of the entire operating company. So that is something, the direction that we need to think of. The next thing is data governance. We need to arrange in ecosystems, usually internally in organizations. We basically can use directives and standards. So you have to treat data creation this way. Only you are allowed to use this data, and I set this down in a standard. And if you basically do not obey, then you will be sanctioned, so to say. But we do not have these hierarchical instruments in ecosystems, because everybody is free to join or to leave, right? So we need to have, again, incentive systems that create desired behavior in the use and management of data. We also need to come up with shared vocabularies, very important. The good thing is that over the last 10 years, we have made enormous progress in this regard. So we have lots of semantic information models out there which can be used as a foundation for shared vocabularies. I'd like to stress, for example, the asset administration shell as an outcome of the platform industry 4.0 as one example. And then lastly, but of course very importantly, because it's the foundation for the rest, we need to think about, let's say, how to design the federated software infrastructure. How should it look like, and which pieces should it consist of? So the federated software service infrastructure is, of course, the necessary requirement for Gaia-X success. But as you can see in this chart, obviously not the sufficient requirement. And that is why we need to address these things all together, in my point of view, in parallel. That's what we have up front of us. And the good news is that we already, we do not start, as mentioned earlier, with a blank sheet of paper, but we start with lots of great ideas, in particular when looking into incentives and funding systems. And with saying that, I'd like to hand over to you guys, Nick and Christian, to share with us a couple of your ideas.
Thank you, Boris. In our Economy of Things project at Bosch, we have been working on the fundamentals for efficient, socially fair data spaces for a couple of years already. Boris rightly said that having incentive systems and funding models, apart from other requirements, are important for building lively data spaces. Basically, we want to engage the community to contribute to Gaia-X, and we want to make sure sufficient funds can be collected and are spent efficiently. Key to fulfill both requirements is determining the future value of Gaia-X, but not only determining it, but making that value actionable and measurable. How to do that, we want to show now. So Gaia-X is in a very good shape regarding governance activities. That is, we have rules and norms how to work together as a group of companies and individuals. That's what you see on the left-hand side of the slide. But next to a good governance, it's now essential to simply sounds too simple, to simply build a lively Gaia-X infrastructure. On the right-hand side, you see a rail network. Don't be irritated. We are going to use that a bit later. So we are not planning to build a new railroad network, but we'll use it as an analogy later on. That we now have to start building, obviously, building this system is clear. But many questions have to be answered by the stakeholders of a future Gaia-X ecosystem, so that the builders and later providers know exactly what to do. And some of these questions are, what parts of the infrastructure have priority? Who should build which parts? And most importantly, how much should it cost and who pays the bill? To answer these last questions, this last question, we have to turn it around. We have to ask all stakeholders, what is the future value of the Gaia-X infrastructure for each of you? With that trick, we can unify the goals, costs, and strategies, what we call utilities, of all stakeholders into one actionable and measurable value. And if we do that right, we can redistribute that value to the builders of Gaia-X via our good governance we already have in place. This value of Gaia-X can only be discovered by using a market that aligns all stakeholder utilities, as I said. So here in the middle, we have a Venn diagram showing the optimal situation, a high overlap of utilities for the most important stakeholder groups. The investors that invest money and resources into the system. In an endeavor like Gaia-X, investors can be both private and public. Then we have the providers that later provide services within Gaia-X, and most importantly, the users of the system. Now, how do you correctly discover the value of something? Well, as I already hinted, in a market economy, you can simply ask the market. Classically, this is done in a corporate setting by doing an initial public offering of stocks. The money raised by that offering clearly reflects the value the market sees. But that is not a good solution for us. Publicly traded companies primarily maximize stakeholder value. Going down that route would create the very monster we want to tame by initiating Gaia-X in the first place. Well, what else? Another classic approach for initiatives paying into the greater good of European sovereignty could be to use public funding to fuel consortial activities and produce knowledge and code for the public domain. But here we face another shortcoming. We measure costs, not value. Furthermore, we have a bias against users as the entity spending the money would be mostly providers. And assuming that an open source approach would work is also a risky bet. So no solution to this requirement determining the value of Gaia-X. Well, we would not be here today if we haven't an answer to that. We could ask the market to evaluate the rights to use a Gaia-X ecosystem in a cooperative setting. Only this approach, from our point of view, ensures long-term coincidence of utilities of all stakeholders and allow measuring the success of a future Gaia-X ecosystem. As the concept of a right to use is key to understand our proposal, Christian Heise will explain it via an historic analogy. Christian, please.
Yes, thanks, Nick. So let's use an analogy. Imagine a small region with businesses on it. They produce some goods and they trade amongst each other. So they have relied on an infrastructure that has been built before they have gotten into business, and they've happily used it for some time. This is kind of data-driven business today, right? So we have some companies founding their data business on existing cloud operator offerings with all their drawbacks, simply because of a lack of good alternatives. So back to the analogy. So these businesses here depend on transportation infrastructure to get their goods from their factories to their customers. Unfortunately, the existing road network does not satisfy their needs anymore. And so, for example, they do not provide the safety for their transported goods. And many other companies do simply not trust the existing operators. But overall, everyone needs to have those roads and needs to look for a way to improve them. So in this analogy, the problem is that the road network is operated by some logistics providers who, on the one hand, provide high quality services, but on the other hand, control how and which goods can be transported. They kind of determine the terms and conditions to use the road. And in Gaia-X terms, this simply means there are cloud offerings and data markets, but they are dominated by strong forces which do not necessarily align with our European ideals, and for example, in data protection guidelines. So a number of representatives as a Gaia-X from businesses come together and think about how can we improve the conditions and what would be a better plan for transporting goods. So they would come up with an idea of a railroad infrastructure. So this infrastructure will be partly built on top of the road that already exists, but also partly replace it. And to have more control, all of these operators or businesses, they decide to take matters into their own hands and collectively own and operate the railroad infrastructure. Collectively building the railroad, of course, requires to split work and specialize on certain aspects. For example, tunnel drilling and rail installation in open spaces require different skills, different equipment, different planning, and different funding. But both parties need to agree on a standard for the base components, in this example, the width or size of the tracks of the railroad. And in Gaia-X terms, this means we have a good understanding on the requirements from future users of the Gaia-X infrastructure. And we've already invested a great amount of work into basic technology and possible common standards. So now let's have a look at the economic side of building a new competitive infrastructure. There are two major challenges to build this railroad infrastructure in our analogy. The business, they are experts in the area, but none of them are railroad experts. So they see the benefit in the system, but they cannot really finance it. The second is that nobody really can put a price tag on the benefit of a better infrastructure, since it will take some time to actually build it and move businesses onto it, right? So in terms of reducing the financial risk, they turn to their local city council. Since the city council can also not answer those questions, it has to decide how to incentivize the businesses to actually build the new railroad system. A traditional approach would be to reduce the risk by taking over part of the cost of the business. Now, the natural incentive here for the contractors is to build the infrastructure by spending the money. We could get some unnecessary components on the way or just inefficient solutions. For example, circumventions instead of a direct bridge connection, simply because the budget needs to be spent and more efficient mechanisms are not financially active for the contractors at the time of building. The city council has no way to track whether the money is well spent, only that it has been spent. So how to build the most efficient version of an infrastructure? City Council comes up with a nifty trick to have businesses assess the value for the future railroad infrastructure. And that is by granting the participants a right to use to the future railroad system. Now, technically, they would provide tickets for using the future railroad system service, but way before they can actually be used. So terms of the tickets are clearly defined. For example, they say each ticket allows 1 kilogram of cargo to be transported for 10 kilometers on the future system. So since that system does not exist yet, the tickets are relatively cheap in the beginning, okay? So now each of the businesses can assess whether they transport more and safer on the future railroad systems, and they will buy tickets accordingly. And in Gaia-X terms, this means that we can address the different needs of different stakeholders and each and everyone's valuation. It will simply be reflected in the amount of tickets they get for themselves. So now the City Council has funds to spend on building that infrastructure. Since all of the initial investors now have a lot of tickets saved and want to act on their right to use, they will do their best on building the most efficient infrastructure. And also people who bought the tickets will closely observe and steer the council's decision on how to spend money efficiently. So now the investors, private or public, can control, measure, and invest in the future infrastructure. Two effects occur. One, the original idea of the infrastructure will be built in the most efficient and effective way. And secondly, new businesses see the benefit of the railroad system and will build their businesses adjacent or on top of the railroad. For example, new train stations, new intersections, stuff like that, you know. And that has to be the objective of Gaia-X as well. So building a digital infrastructure based on the European values and becoming a foundation for future innovations. Now, once the trains run, in this analogy, there will be a demand for tickets. So the holder of early tickets can decide whether they use them for their own needs, for example, for their business, or whether they sell them to others. And the market for tickets at a time will determine the price. This makes an initial incentive for early contributors, since they can redeem their rights to use in the system or benefit from their early discounts and sell them at a market price. So in the end, we will have the most efficient infrastructure that can be built. And that's the end of my analogy here. Just one more thing. Of course, we cannot sell tickets to Gaia-X. So tickets are actually a right to use for an infrastructure. So putting the idea of tickets on a decentralized technology simply gets us to the digital equivalent, a Gaia-X token, or more specifically, a utility token. And all owners of such tokens have implicitly agreed to the underlying European values, to the goals of Gaia-X. They agree on their voting rights, they agree to comply to their policies and rules, and they invest in building Gaia-X. And that's back to you, Nick.
Thank you, Christian. So Gaia-X tokens secure funds to build the infrastructure and to continuously measure future value growth as well. This creates accountability, especially for the private and potentially public investors. Tokens furthermore ensure long-term incentive alignment of all public and private stakeholders. They secure they secure funds for building Gaia-X infrastructure. Estimations see an initial stakeholder valuation between 10 and 30 billion euros. Early public and private investors take risk to finance the infrastructure and get reward when it's actually used. Tokens are used to pay for services the Gaia-X systems provide once in operation. So working together for a common good, like the European data sovereignty, is deeply ingrained in human nature, forming communities for a long time. The cooperative idea has been reinvented many times over in history, continuously being updated to meet current challenges when new legal and technological opportunities arise. We believe that digital tokens are such an opportunity. That is why we invite the Gaia-X community to build the cornerstones for a new kind of impactful European digital cooperative. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Excellent. So as mentioned earlier on, I think what we see here is that we have, let's say, much of, let's say, brain power already invested in, let's say, how to bring the things down to the road and also to address the different perspectives that we need to take when we create data spaces. Before I hand over back to Carmen, I don't want to miss a very special opportunity, because it was brought to my attention that today is a very special day, Carmen, because it's your birthday, if I'm not mistaken,
no!
right? So you talked yourself about commitment, you know, and when you introduced the summit earlier on today, and that is a very nice commitment from your side that you took the decision to spend your birthday with us, and I think that's the spirit of Gaia that we want to convey. So happy birthday from my side, but I guess I can speak on behalf of all the organizing team, but also the entire audience. So yeah, thank you very much for hosting us in the first day. Happy birthday. Hope you can enjoy your birthday this evening, but not too much, because we need you tomorrow, of course. Right?
Yeah,
now
sure.
back to you.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, this is really a surprise. You really catched me now here. I never ever get flowers during an online conference here, and I think it's all about future shaping. So a birthday is about future shaping. Gaia-X is about future shaping, and I think to shape the future, we need a great community. So this is a great sign from you, and thank you so much. May I throw it to you? She catched it. Thank you very much to Mr. Otto, Mr. Scharmann, and Mr. Heise. Yeah, and ladies and gentlemen, the first day of our Gaia-X Summit is coming to an end, and we want to know from you, what is the most inspiring thought you're taking home after the first summit day? I give you a few moments to answer this question, and I will follow the poll here with my iPad. What is the most inspiring thought you're taking home from the Gaia-X Summit today? As I know, we have a short delay from the studio to you. So, and here the first answers are popping up. It's interconnection, health application, founding schema, sharing. Data is your new oil, yeah, definitely. Ambitious. And now, more and more results are popping up. Wow, that's good. Governance, work to do, complex, data ecosystem, importance of data spaces, data space interoperability. Tokenomics, yeah, quite interesting. Federation. And more words are coming in here. Moonshot. Work to do, yes. A lot of work to do, but great potentials. Great community, absolutely. It's all about community, isn't it? And what else can I see? Really interesting, because as I can see, their answers have something in common. You know, it's about cooperation, community, some technical aspects here, but also, yeah, quite diverse answers. Sharing, trust. Very good word. Thank you for this. Enabler, future. Yeah, common understanding, collaboration. As I can see, federation. As I can see, it's a lot about, simply said in a nutshell, doing the job together. So let's do it. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. So great to have you with us, and I wish you a great time, and we are really looking forward to see you tomorrow. Bye. Enjoy your evening.